So thank you so much for being here, Professor Susanna Loeb, and just go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming to this. I apologize for not being able to speak Spanish, particularly since you won't have anything to look at. So hopefully this will go okay. The first paper that I wanted to talk about is called Using Student Test Scores to Measure Principal Performance. And there's substantial recent policy interest in the U.S. in using test scores, standardized test scores, to evaluate the performance of not only principals but teachers and other staff in the schools. In New York, for example, there's a law that you need to use in the evaluation between 20 and 40% of it needs to be based on student learning outcomes. In Louisiana, it's 50%. In Florida, it's 50%. So the states are passing laws that say that you need to use student learning outcomes, not necessarily the standardized tests, but some kinds of student learning outcomes in evaluation. There's quite a large literature that's focused on issues of using test scores for teachers. And actually, I'm part of a group that's trying to summarize that literature in a way that's broadly understandable. And it's called the Carnegie Knowledge Network. If you're looking for resources, I think they've gotten some good people who understand the measures well to write some nice briefs. But in contrast to kind of this vast literature that looks at using test scores to measure teachers, there's really very little that looks at using test scores to measure principals. Now, why might we want to measure principals? In the U.S., not that many years ago, the principal job was somewhat of a bureaucratic job where you had to keep things organized but weren't as much thought of as the instructional leader and really organizational leader of the school. But the policies have changed. The accountability policies, really the idea behind accountability is to give schools more autonomy, but then have a measure to make sure that they're meeting their goals. And so they have more freedom in how to use their resources, but they're then held accountability for some kinds of student learning gains. School-based budgeting, what are called mutual consent agreements have become common in big urban areas where principals get to choose which teachers they hire. So it's now less common for districts to assign teachers to schools. The teacher and the principal have to agree that they should be there. Charter schools, those are all places where the principal kind of takes a central role. There's also growing evidence that what principals do affect what goes on in the school. They affect teachers a lot. They affect students. And just in general, there's been a lot more policy attention in the U.S. to principals. Now, one question is whether are principals just like teachers when you're thinking about using evaluations to measure, or using test scores to measure how effective they are? And in some ways, the things that we've learned for teachers do apply to principals. For example, which tests you use for students makes a big difference. So if you want to care about the outcomes you're measuring, right? So if you measure one set of outcomes and those outcomes aren't aligned to what the school's doing, the school or the principal or the teacher is not going to look good, even if they're very effective at doing this other thing. So you really want the tests to measure the standards that you have, the goals that you have. Student sorting. So worrying that different principals or different teachers are working with different students, that's going to be a concern both for principals and students, and you have to think about that. What's actually even more of a concern with teachers and with principals would be my guess is not so much the bias from the sorting. Is this okay? Okay. This helps me. Oh, I don't know. I could, well. is measurement error. So even if on average they're right, there's a lot of error in there. So for a particular teacher or a particular principal, there can be a lot of error in using student test performance because you're just measuring some kids and they might have a good day or they might have a bad day. And so all these things are kind of the same when you're thinking about teachers and you're thinking about principals. But in important ways, principals are different than teachers. For example, a principal affects students in multiple years. So just looking at 1 year growth might not be as fair for principals as it is for teachers. A teacher sees a student for 1 year. A principal may, have great effects moving students from one grade to another and less in the upper years, and you want to kind of be able to consider the whole school. The probably bigger issue is that their effects are indirect. So instead of working one-on-one clearly with students in the classroom, they work through the teachers or they work through the other resources, and they don't have complete control over those resources. So they have some control over what happens in the school, but not complete control. For teachers, we can often compare teachers serving in the same school to see whether students are learning more in one class than another. And what's nice about that is the students are about the same. It's much harder. Clearly you can't do that for principals in the same year because there's only one in a school. So while there are some similarities, there are also a bunch of differences that we have to think about when we're trying to use test scores to measure principal performance. So the goals of this study, we had 4 goals. And the first is to identify a range of different kinds of measures that you could create using student test scores to create measures of principal effectiveness. The second is to consider the conceptual issues associated with those, which makes more sense in how we think the world works. The third is to use longitudinal data on student learning to create these different measures and see how they're related to each other. And then finally is to move outside of student test performance and compare these measures to measures like district evaluations, so evaluations of supervisors or evaluations of the principal by the assistant principal, or how well the school is doing in terms of what students and parents and staff think about the climate of the school. Try to compare these test score measures to other kinds of measures. So those are what we're going to do here. Good? Okay. I have an equation. I can't speak in equation. Uh-oh. Okay, so how should we think about how principals affect schools? Well, or how principals affect students? Well, generally, the way that we thought about it is that student achievement is a function both of characteristics that the student has and of characteristics of the school. Something about the school affects how much kids learn. And then this kind of school effect on kids is, in turn, a function both of the principal and what the principal can control and other things. So other things that are outside the control of the principal. And in thinking about how it would be best to measure principal effectiveness depends a lot on how you think that school system works, how you think that effect of schools on students works in terms of the relationship between the principal effect and the effect of other things. And in particular, 2 things are important to consider. The first is timing. Do you think that the principal comes into a school and has an immediate effect that is constant? Well, generally we don't, so that's right. But so the one option, though, would be that they come in, and so they could do things like reorganize who's teaching where so that people are teaching things that match their skills better. They could kind of create an energy, bring an energy to school, something that happens relatively quickly, kind of pushing people to work harder. But the other kind of, I think, more reasonable view is that they build this culture slowly. They are able to attract new teachers into the school. That may not be the case here, but they do something that works more slowly, and so timing matters, whether you think it's immediate or you think it's kind of builds over time. And the other thing that's important is how much of the school you think the principal controls. Like if you think they really are in control of everything, then that's one way of looking at it. You don't really have to worry too much about separating out the parts of the school that they don't control from what they do control. But if you think they don't control very much of it, and there's just little bits that they control, and you want to really separate the principal from the school, you have to think about how to do that carefully. Okay. So we're going to try 3 approaches. And the first approach, which also has an equation in it, is if you think the principal effects are immediate and most of the school is under the control of the principal. It's kind of the simplest view. And the way that I think of it is then you're pretty much equating the principal effect with how good the school is while the principal is there. And so to create this measure, what you really want to do is to see how much the students are learning in the school while the principal is there, and adjust that for characteristics that the kids brought into the school. So you want to take account of the student background and all of those kinds of things, but you don't have to worry so much about things like what the stock of teachers was, or what the culture in the school was, or something like that when the principal came in. You just think the principal controls all that. I just have to take similar students in this school and in this school, and I want to see if one group learns more than another. And so this measure of principal value added or principal effectiveness is very much like the teacher measure. And so we can use the same kind of approach that we've used for teachers to measure it for principals. Generally, what people do is they use a regression and they predict the student test performance based on their prior performance and their characteristics, and then the remainder that's at the average that's at the school level, you attribute that to the principal. Okay, so that's really going to be our first measure. And there are hundreds of different ways that you can do it because you can adjust for different things, but conceptually that's the first approach.